Well, let's jump into Leviticus 18 for a little bit. Leviticus 18, if you've ever read this, this isn't going to surprise you, but this is the most complete collection of sexual laws, again, prohibited sexual relationships within the Torah. Again, there's a lot of them in there. We're not going to parse every one of them because, frankly, a lot of them are pretty self-explanatory. But I think, some of the logic here needs to be pointed out. Why do you have forbidden sexual relationships at all? Well, there are a couple of reasons. One was it had the effect of sort of delimiting or building the boundaries of what was conceived of as the immediate family, the family unit, versus the extended family, people that would sort of become part of your family through marriage. Well, that was different than family members that were close relatives. In other words, your own kids, okay, that kind of thing, the ones that you brought into being, and so on and so forth. So these laws have the effect of defining what the immediate family, what constitutes the immediate family, that is, sexual relationships are forbidden within immediate family members or among immediate family members outside the husband, the man, and his wife or wives, okay? And again, you can't, it's part of the logic why you don't take someone else's wife, you don't commit adultery, you don't take someone else's wife and make them your own, because they, again, that you're violating a family, an immediate, family boundary there. Now, outside, again, the man and his wife or wives and their children, outside of, again, those sorts of boundaries, you could marry within the extended family members, what the Bible, what the Old Testament patriarchal culture would refer to as the mishpakhah, the clan. Okay. In fact, those marriages were actually encouraged because they, again, magnified or grew the extended family, and they created more immediate families within the context of the greater clan. So the sexual laws have a way of defining, which group is which and what are the boundaries between the groups, that sort of thing. So Levine says here, for instance, quote, "The immediate family was formed by a man who married one or more wives, thereby initiating the process of procreation. This conception of the family explains why the regulations governing sexual behavior were addressed to the male." Again, there's always male language in these Leviticus passages. They're addressed to the male as the head of the family rather than somebody else, because the male had more sort of immediate control over the situation, again, respecting these boundaries. Now, let's talk a little bit about a couple of these things. Again, I'm not going to read through the whole chapter. You could do that, again, about uncovering the nakedness of XYZ. There's a whole listing of these. Let's talk about a couple. Let's talk about incest. Now, Levine, again, I think has a nice handy way of parsing this and describing this. And so I'm going to quote him again, then just sort of branch off from this. Levine writes, "Two principles govern the definition of incest in the code of chapter 18 and through the rest of the Torah." Because, let me just stop here. You get this question all the time. Well, isn't marrying like your second cousin, isn't that incest? Well, it might be incest by our cultural boundaries. But again, within the patriarchal culture of the Old Testament, these chapters describe what is the immediate family and what is not. So again, back to Levine here. So there's two principles that govern what is incest and what isn't within the Torah. Number one, she'er, that's the Hebrew term for flesh relations in Levine's parlance here. She'er, which sometimes is known as consanguineal or blood relations. And number two, ervah, which is the word for nakedness. This is a euphemism for sexuality. Again, continuing with Levine, the nuclear family was founded on 6 she'er relatives: mother, father, son, daughter, brother, and sister. That was the immediate family. We learned this indirectly from the code of purity governing the Israelite priesthood. According to Leviticus 21:2 and 3, an ordinary priest, usually forbidden to defile himself through contact with a corpse, was, nevertheless, permitted to attend the burial of any one of these 6 relatives. Again, this is the near family. Levine continues, the she'er relationship is extended in 18:12-13 from Leviticus 21 to include the sister of one's father or mother. The she'er relatives are in a different category from the members of the family related by affinity, those who become a man's relatives by marriage. The basic principle regulating sexual union with affinity relatives is conveyed by the term ervah, nakedness. The only exception is levirate marriage, which according to Deuteronomy 25:5-10 is something you do if, again, the You have a situation where a woman's husband has died and there's no one, really, to take, their place. Again, the concern was to keep the man's name alive and his descendants and his heritage, his property, all that stuff. And so the levirate system was there to take care of that. Levin says that's really the only exception here. So you have, again, to summarize what Levin is saying, you have she'er relationships, mother, father, son, daughter, brother, sister, and then non-she'er relationships. And the prohibition against having sexual relationships with those that are near to you, again, is expressed with phrases like uncovering someone's nakedness. Again, that's just the idiomatic way of expressing it. But there's a certain logic to both groups. Now, two notes here that I think are really worth pointing out because I think listeners will find them interesting. If you look at the language here in Leviticus 18, where you have the phrase uncovering the nakedness of, all over the place. You have it through the chapter. If you look at the instances where the passage talks about uncovering the nakedness of one's father or uncovering the nakedness of one's uncle, and of course that would mean having sex with, your father's wife or your uncle's wife. In other words, it's beyond voyeurism. This is the idiomatic expression of, to have sexual relationships with your mom, your father's wife, or your uncle's wife. If you take that, now think about the term uncovering the nakedness, that idiomatic expression, the verb there, uncovering. If you go to Leviticus 20, here's what you read. If a man takes his sister, a daughter of his father or a daughter of his mother, and sees her nakedness. Now it's not uncovering nakedness, it's seeing nakedness. And she sees his nakedness, it is a disgrace. And they shall be cut off in the sight of the children of their people. He has uncovered his sister's nakedness, and he shall bear his iniquity. Now you see what that verse does. That verse equates seeing someone's nakedness and uncovering someone's nakedness. They're synonymous idiomatic expressions in that passage. And you say, well, who cares? Why point this out? Well, I would suggest that you take this back to Genesis 9. The sin of Ham, and Noah, and Ham commits this heinous crime, but Ham isn't the one punished. Canaan is. His son is punished. And people have wondered for generations, what in the world's going on with that? Well, how does this make any sense? Now, again, here we go again. I could post an article to this on this, on the blog, and now since I brought it up, I'll do that. But I would suggest to you that you read this article. I think it presents a compelling case that what Ham does is not just merely looking at his father's naked body, at Noah's naked body. It's also not having incestual sex with Noah. In other words, homosexual incest with his father, violating his father that way. But he sees the nakedness of his father. And what that means in Leviticus language is that he has maternal incestual relationships. He has sex with his mom. And the reason Canaan is punished is because Canaan is the product of that union. Again, that might kind of blow your minds right now, but that's why I'll post the article. It's quite compelling. It explains the logic of what not only Ham does, why Canaan is cursed instead of Ham. Canaan is cursed because when Ham does this, when you take the leader's wife or wives, think of David, think of Absalom, when you do this, you're asserting that you are now taking control of the tribe. You are taking control of, again, what belongs to the patriarch. You are usurping that position for your own. So this was a move on the part of Ham to take control of the family after the flood, to take control away from Noah. So he violates his mother. He takes his dad's wife, his woman, and says, I am the leader now. He tells his brothers, and the brothers, so they can distance themselves from the whole thing, they go in and they even go backward. They go in and they cover their father's nakedness. In other words, they cover their mom, to make it clear that they have no participation. They oppose what's going on here. And then when Noah discovers what has happened, he curses not Ham, he curses Canaan. Basically, he's cutting off with a curse Ham's line that Ham would have thought, now I'm building my own dynasty here. This is my child by my mom's womb. Noah curses it and says, we're going to put a stop to that right now. So again, read the article, but I wanted to mention it here because the language here in Leviticus 18 along with Leviticus 20, contributes, I think, to understanding what's going on in Genesis 9. Again, that was a bit of a rabbit trail, but I think it's interesting. Second thing to bring up here is why in Leviticus 18, let's go down to, let's see, verse 19. You shall not approach, here we are smack dab in this list of who not to have sex with and why and when. It says, you shall not approach a woman to uncover her nakedness while she's in her menstrual uncleanness. Again, because you're going to be infected, you'll be ritually impure. Okay, verse 20. And you shall not lie sexually with your neighbor's wife, and so make yourself unclean with her. Again, not only would you be impure, but that's also adultery because she's married to another man. Verse 21, you shall not give any of your children to offer them to Molech, and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. I am Yahweh. Verse 22, you shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. And you shall not lie with any animal, so that you make yourself unclean with it. Neither shall any woman give herself to an animal to lie with it. It is perversion. Now, here's the question. Why is homosexuality not grouped with the preceding list of sexual relations that were prohibited? Why is it instead grouped with the abominations of child sacrifice and bestiality? Again, because they just seem so much worse than the stuff that has preceded. Why is homosexuality grouped in that bunch? Well, a little bit of background here. And again, I'm not going to go off too far on a lecture homosexuality and ancient attitudes toward it. Other cultures, this is Israel. Israel is an exception here across the board, but other cultures allowed homosexual sex. In other words, it wasn't severely punished, even though it was generally looked down upon. It really depended on the context, because a man, for instance, could rape another man to degrade them, to bring them into submission, or to establish, like with the Greek pederasty system, to establish sort of an order of authority and submission with their younger male charges that they were training to be warriors, that kind of thing. It was just something that you all had this done to you until you sort of grew up, and now you were the aggressor. You were the one that was going to, again, teach in this, again, to what sounds to my ear like a very perverse way of teaching. You're going to teach, submission, male authority, the pecking order, so to speak, in this culture through this act. This is, again, I'm just using the Greeks for an example. This didn't happen, across the board in ancient cultures, but that's sort of a handy example. That sort of activity was not looked down upon in certain cultures because it was just, again, part of, this is how you teach authority. Okay, you humble these other young boys, these young men, and this is part of their training, again, to be warriors. Okay, so that wasn't something you'd punish. It was one of the contexts that in ancient cultures allow for this. Now, Israel never allows for again, the homosexual act in any of these contexts at all. So Israel's kind of unique in this regard, and commentators, again, are very familiar with this. It was homosexual sex, though, was looked poorly upon. It was derided when in the cases of the male who was in the submissive role. In other words, the male who was penetrated or violated, and not so much the penetrator, because that was the aggressor. That, he was, again, establishing power. So males were just generally not supposed to play the submissive role of women. And so when you had that situation, then broadly speaking in ancient culture, homosexuality was looked down upon in that setting. So it could be looked down on in some setting and not looked down on in others. It just depended on the context. Now, lesbianism never really gets the same attention, especially in the ancient Near East, doesn't get much attention at all. And I think, now this is just me talking, I'm going to explain this in a moment. I think it's likely because, this is going to sound really odd, because no children were lost or killed, in quotation marks. You say, well, what the heck are you talking about? I mean, what in the world's going on with that? Children killed through homosexuality? That doesn't make any sense at all. That's just terrible to say. Well, again, we're not speaking literally, or we're not speaking, again, the language of the way a modern person would think about sex. Just hold that thought. I'll get to it in a moment, what I mean by that. I'm going to have a quote here from Milgram that I think, again, helps, and then we'll return to some of my own personal thoughts about why homosexuality gets lumped in with these other offenses. But Milgram says, the difference between biblical legislation and other Near Eastern laws must not be overlooked. The Bible allows for no exceptions all acts of sodomy are prohibited, whether performed by rich or poor, high or low status, citizen or alien. So it has these cultural allowances. This is me talking now. These cultural allowances that you're going to see in other parts of the ancient world, they did not apply in ancient Israel. Back to Milgram, he says, many theories have been propounded to provide a rationale for this prohibition, again, this across-the-board prohibition. One must surely exist, since this absolute ban on homosexual intercourse is unique not only in the Bible, but as shown in Olyan's study, to the entire ancient Near Eastern classical world. Again, Israel is the exception. To be sure, Milgram again, a rationale is given with staccato emphasis, the pollution of the land, in the concluding exhortation, again, in these chapters of Leviticus, but that does not explain the individual prohibitions in the list. Okay? Now, dropping down a little bit in the quotation here, some of the explanations that have been offered. Again, the connection with idolatry, maybe that's the reason. Milgram also includes the blurring of boundaries, again, between the genders. Maybe that's an explanation. Wasting of male seed, semen, maybe that's an explanation. The mixing of semen with other defiling liquids, again, in homosexual intercourse, on the grounds that they don't share sort of the same properties, or one represents life and excrement would represent death. Maybe that's going on in the ancient mind. Maybe that's the reason for a total prohibition. Again, he just goes through a number of these options, and then he says this: the common denominator of all the prohibitions, I submit, this is Milgram, is that they involve the emission of semen for the purpose of copulation, resulting in either incest and illicit progeny, or, as in this case, lack of progeny. Again, homosexual relationships, or the destruction of progeny in the case of Molech worship. In a word, the theme is procreation. This rationale fully complements and presupposes, again, the laws of Leviticus 15, 16, and 18. Semen emission per se is not forbidden. It just defiles, again, ritually, but purificatory rites can follow. But in certain cases of sexual congress, it is strictly forbidden, and severe consequences must follow. End of quote. Now, here's why, again, with that as a backdrop and what I've said earlier, here's why I think, this is just me talking now, why I think homosexuality, instead of being listed in the forefront of Leviticus 18, gets lumped in with offering your children to Molech and bestiality and that sort of thing. I think that the logic, the rationale is this: homosexuality and bestiality were A, contrary to creation order. That is, you're copulating with someone or something else where procreation could not be the result. In other words, it couldn't produce children. So therefore, it's contrary to creation order. And B, killing children was also contrary to procreation. So what I'm getting at here is that the pre-scientific idea that the child was resident in the man, in their semen, the seed. The child was deposited by the man into the womb of a woman, and there it would grow, and it would grow into life, and then it would be born. It's procreation. That is impossible in homosexuality, and so homosexuality gets viewed as causing the loss of life, because you're having semen emitted that cannot produce life. It is prohibited from producing life, again, because the view is that the man is depositing a child in the woman's womb so it can grow. And if that sexual act is in a context of copulation where that child cannot, I hate to use the planting metaphor, take root and grow, again, these are these ancient concepts, then you're essentially killing it. Because the end of that child is going to be death, because it's not in the womb of a woman. You can't have it in the womb of an animal, okay, or again, inside another man. And that is the inherent logic to this wholesale, again, prohibition. So what you have here is, again, homosexuality is looked upon negatively for two reasons, again, in the Torah. Again, it's contrary to creation order because creation, the sexual act, is ultimately designed for procreation. And that's not to say that you're never supposed to have sex. Biblical people thought you couldn't have sex for pleasure, okay? I mean, there is the Song of Solomon. There is, Paul's talk in 1 Corinthians 7 about orienting sexual behavior with pleasure in the context of marriage. Okay, we get that. We're going back here to the ultimate purpose of copulation, and that was producing children, okay? So if you're doing it in a context where you can't produce children, that is contrary to creation order. And secondly, it ends up, in the case of bestiality and homosexuality, it ends up terminating the life of the child that was thought to be deposited in the womb. It's like killing. It's like murder. That's why it gets grouped where it groups. Now, I also think this is why lesbian relationships get no attention. Again, because in a lesbian relationship, you don't have the loss of life because there's no semen involved. And so that, again, is something that just, it wasn't a concern. Now, Paul later on is going to, talk about lesbian relationships. But here in the Old Testament, in the context of, again, delineating what the immediate family is, what the extended family is, and why you have an immediate family and why you shouldn't, have sexual relations within the immediate family. The immediate family is to create children with your wife and nobody else. The extended family, that's something different. You could marry into the clan. All that stuff is about procreation and copulation. So it has nothing to do with lesbian relationships, because it's just not a question. Semen is not in the picture. And so I think that's why lesbian relationships in the Torah just don't get any attention at all. Now, later on, Paul, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. In those two elements are the biblical rationale behind condemning homosexuality. Now, in today's scientific context, the second one doesn't work because we know that children, whole persons, are not in the male, in the sperm. Okay, we know that. We know where babies come from. We know what genetics is all. We know all this. So the second part of the rationale goes by the wayside. It doesn't work. The first one, though, is still intact, and that is this is contrary to creation order. And that is actually the basis of what Paul says in Romans 1. Paul doesn't he doesn't link this with killing and kids dying, and he doesn't do any of that. Okay? So what Paul's tracking on in that chapter, and what, again, becomes the theological rationale in the New Testament for opposing homosexuality, and also to be consistent with the Old Testament. But at the core of it, Paul's argument, and he includes both types of homosexual relationship, which is significant. He includes men with men, women with women, doing that which is unnatural. His argument is that doing this is contrary to creation order. You're not exercising this gift of God for the reason that God wanted you to have it, the reason why he gave it to you. So this is contrary to God's design. That is at the heart of the New Testament thinking about homosexuality. Whereas in the Old Testament, this other aspect becomes a little more clear, even though it's odd to us. And it really results from, again, a pre-scientific conception of where babies come from. But that's why it was viewed as such a heinous thing, just across the board, because it terminated life. And it belongs with other things that prevent life or take life. That's the rationale in the Old Testament. Now, to wrap up here, again, both of those were sort of, one was kind of a rabbit trail. The other one, I think, was more germane to Leviticus 18. But to wrap up here, just a couple things, again, that you can think about how they relate to us. And again, just to sort of recap for interest. I hope you noticed in Leviticus 17 anyway, you had a severe punishment for violating rules of sacred space. These sorts of violations of how you worship God were viewed as very serious, to the point of having this karat idea attached to the violation. Now, it's natural for us to see God as more tolerant today, but I think at the very least we could take a hint about examining what it is we do in worship. Maybe we could give it more of a God focus and not a worshiper focus, because a lot of what happens in church, again, and I'm not saying this is intentional, this is sinister, or anything like that. I think it just happens. A lot of what happens in church is really focused on the experience of the worshiper, even though the goal is, again, to worship God. I think that's still there. That's still, at least in many churches, is still going to be the motivation. But the way things are conducted really focus on the experience of the worshiper as opposed to the object of worship. We judge good worship by whether we are bored or not. That's really foreign to a biblical mindset. It wasn't about either being entertained or even having your senses excited, or however you want to put that. It was really about doing things to show God that we assign importance to him and not ourselves. That we're thinking about what he wants from us and not what we hope to get out of the sermon. Again, that sort of thing. So I think we can at least take that hint from what's going on in Leviticus here. Secondly, since we are sacred space, and we've talked about this concept before. Since we are sacred space, the juxtaposition of these two chapters, think about it, sacred space rules, and then you have sexual boundary rules. I think the juxtaposition of those two concepts is worth noting. This is, again, part of the logic why Paul talks about he links, fornication with sinning against your own body, because you're the temple. Again, this is the language from 1 Thessalonians 4, language of 1 Corinthians 3, 1 Corinthians 6. Again, there's something going on in Paul's head as to why he links these things. And I think the juxtaposition here of Leviticus 17 and 18 are part of what's floating around in his head. And thirdly, sexual prohibitions should not be viewed as arbitrary. They had a logic to them that was pro-life and pro-family. Again, sex wasn't exclusively focused on personal pleasure or personal convenience. Again, the pleasure part is going to go without saying, and that's not prohibited, again, within the boundaries of the biblical family, biblical morality. That's not divorced from the picture, but the ultimate focus was on producing life and producing family. So I think, again, in our culture, it's basically sort of a sex-crazed culture, we tend to view any prohibition on any pleasure we can experience as totally mean and arbitrary. And then, of course, people beat up the Bible for this. It wasn't. These passages are not written so that space is devoted to being mean. They're written to reinforce a worldview that elevated the production of and care for human life. And I think that's just an important takeaway from these two chapters.
Mike, this is such a hot topic in the Christian community. I'm trying to frame my question and thoughts on this here. In dealing with Leviticus 20:13, when dealing with the actual punishment of homosexuality. In the New Testament, though, I know it's brought up a few times, but it's not necessarily punishable.
Right.
And so by accepting Jesus, I'm wondering if do you know where I'm going with this?
Well, I'm not sure, but in the New Testament you lose the theocratic context, and it would depend on what the person was exposed to, and I even hate to call like Greek medicine scientific, because if you read Hippocrates, we drift off into the head covering thing again, that the woman's hair has something to do with fecundity. They're not science, they're not doing science there, okay? It might be better than what it was, but at the very least, the theocratic context of this is taken away. And so you don't have really a situation where the community can be governed in any sort of meaningful or secure way in a theocratic system. And in fact, I'm not familiar with Roman law enough to say that, hey, if a group of Jewish elders, punished a homosexual person with death, would that have been a violation of Roman law? I don't really know. But in any event, you don't read things like that in the New Testament. And that's actually, if you really think about it, that's actually a good thing, because there's opportunity, again, for to come to faith, repentance. Yes, you're going to have a struggle with this or that. Everybody has different struggles because, again, this is me talking. I think that the New Testament theology about sin is that it does have something to do with residing in the flesh, in your body, and its impulses. This is how sin is talked about. We all have our own specific impulses that we have to deal with. So, even if I'm genetically heterosexual, that's where I need to watch my urges. Well, someone homosexual, who's a homosexual, I think could say the same thing. This is in some part genetic. This is in some part what I am in terms of my body, my flesh, my makeup. Okay. Again, I don't think there's any reason to deny that, but just as God can tell me, okay, you're this by birth, so control it. Again, I think he has the right to say you're that by birth, so control it. That kind of thing. I don't think modern science, in other words, trumps the biblical teaching on these things, even though from one testament to the other, the logic of them is not presented the same way.
Is there any literature outside the Bible of how Christians treated homosexuals and that type of thing?
There is. I think the best thing on this is Robert. His last name is Gagnon. He's a professor at somewhere in Pittsburgh. It's either Duquesne or Pittsburgh Seminary, but it's a Catholic school, I think, but I don't know if he's Catholic. But anyway, Gagnon has presented just a voluminous amount of material on homosexuality in the ancient world. And so let me just get the title up here so I don't mistake it, because he's got a couple of books, but there's one that's sort of his big introduction to this: The Bible and Homosexual Practice, Texts and Hermeneutics. This book is quite exhaustive. It is, if I can look at it here real quickly, I have it in my office. It's over 500 pages, and it has a lot of background material. There are other books that deal exclusively like with ancient Near Eastern attitudes and law codes, about homosexuality, but within the Christian community across the Testaments, within Judaism and Christianity, Gagnon's book is the one to get. And he asserts, and frankly demonstrates, that there is no instance within the like a practicing Jewish community in the ancient world, there's no instance of homosexual relationships being looked upon positively. Again, because they're oriented by the Torah. It's kind of obvious. But he does the same thing with the Christian context, because Christianity grew out of Judaism, so they're linked to the Torah there as well. But again, you have a lot of Gentile involvement. So he goes into the Gentile material again, showing the various attitudes, and Gentiles were, again, generally tolerant, depending on the circumstance of homosexuality, depending on the class, the culture, the context in which it occurs, who's the aggressor, who's the one who's not, all these factors. And so the early church has to, it's going to be including a lot of these people, within the believing community who did not grow up thinking like Torah, when it comes to this. And so Gagnon does address, again, how thinkers and writers and leaders in the early church articulated these sorts of things and how they thought about them in light of more so the New Testament, especially Paul, as opposed to necessarily the Old Testament.
And how do modern day Jews deal with punishment?
It's gonna depend on the community. Like Reform Judaism would be very open, to like homosexual rabbis and homosexual activity. You're more, what would be called conservative Judaism would have a very negative view of it. Would refer to it as sin. I hate to, I only know one example of this where I've actually heard someone say it, but Ben Shapiro, who's a talk show host in Seattle, Jewish fellow, conservative. He's not Hasidic, but he's conservative. I've heard him a number of times just referring to homosexuality as sin. So he would be representative of that wing of Judaism. Certainly, Hasidic community would view it as sin, but it's going to be like the Christian world. You get sort of a spectrum of, what the attitudes are, and even down to, okay, what about the orientation versus the activity? Those conversations also go on within a Jewish context as well.
Do any of them adhere to Leviticus 20:13, where they shall surely be put to death? I mean,
no, I don't. It's the same thing again, because you've lost the Judaism of today is in many respects dissimilar to Judaism or Israelite practice in the Old Testament, because not only do you not have a temple, you also don't have a secure priesthood to make these judgments. You also don't have a theocratic community in any sense. So while they can look at the Torah and say, look, the Torah condemns this, so don't do it, when it comes to like specific crimes and punishments within the theocratic context, they're just not doing that. I don't know that I've ever heard an instance in the Jewish community in the Western world, and frankly, I've just never heard it, where someone is actually punished today, again in a modern context, that way for homosexuality, although it's condemned in plenty of cases.
Yeah, I find that interesting that there's some correlation between the Quran there, whether people take it, the radicals take it literal.
Yeah, and a lot of other Muslims, would not. It just, if you're sort of a westernized Muslim and you don't have jihad on the brain, all the time, and that's not how you define what the meaning of the Quran is. And again, and those Muslims typically are, again, very, very westernized. Another Muslim might say, well, you're a liberal Muslim, or whatever the term used is, but they're westernized. They know we're not living, in the 6th century anymore, but yet they want to be Muslim. They want to practice, the other principles of Islam that are there that don't involve jihad. You're going to get much more tolerance in that respect than you would, a radicalized element.